Okay, let's just jump right in. We're talking about an incredible and honestly a confounding figure today, Oscar Wilde.
Hmm.
His name, it's just synonymous with this whole dramatic arc of the late 19th century. You know, the ultimate master of glittering, flamboyant wit.
Oh, absolutely. The writer of these glorious comedies, the high priest of aestheticism.
But then at the same time, his story is also one of the tragic figure, utterly, completely destroyed by Victorian moral fervor and, well, the unforgiving legal machinery of the state.
It is a breathtaking rise, and it's followed by an equally brutal, really shocking fall.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about the sources you've provided is that they let us trace this arc from the very, very beginning. We can cut through all those layers of public myth.
Both of them, right? The celebrated dandy and the condemned felon.
Exactly. We can look at the meticulous facts of his complex and, very self-designed biography.
So that's our deep dive today. We're getting into the life of Oscar Fingal of Flaherty-Wells Wilde, an Irish author, poet, playwright.
Widely considered the greatest playwright of the Victorian era. No question.
Our mission, then, is to move beyond just the quotes and the caricatures. We really need to understand the tension, and that's a word we're going to come back to a lot, the tension between his art and his life, between the public pose and his private compulsions.
Exactly. Our aim is to chart precisely how this key figure in aestheticism, in the decadent movement, how he managed to climb to the absolute height of London society and literary fame in the early 1890s.
Only to have that entire edifice just collapse.
Completely. So we'll track the development of his intellect, his groundbreaking major works, the precise legal mechanism that led to the disaster, and then those painful final years in exile. You can't understand the genius without understanding the tragedy he, in some ways, willingly walked into.
To understand the man who would one day claim that the one duty we owe to history is to rewrite it, we have to start not in, the drawing rooms of London, but in Dublin, his birthplace, 1854.
Right. And his early environment was genuinely unique. It was this medical, intellectual, and cultural milieu that just profoundly shaped his whole sensibility.
You see this fantastic duality right there in his parents, a duality that Oscar would later embody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
His mother, Lady Jane Wilde, was a huge defining influence. I mean, she wrote this fiery, revolutionary poetry under the pseudonym Speranza.
Which means hope.
Exactly. Making her a staunch Irish nationalist who was theatrical, romantic, and she just instilled in her sons this love of poets and the whole neoclassical revival.
She was the myth maker of the family, wasn't she? The sources point out her unshakable belief, which was, completely without foundation, that she had Italian ancestry.
Yeah, trying to link the family to Dante or someone.
It's just a perfect example of elevating your personal reality through artistic fantasy.
And that flamboyance was balanced or maybe directly contradicted by his father, Sir William Wilde.
He was far more empirical.
Totally. He was Ireland's leading ophthalmologic surgeon, an expert in eyes and ears, and he was knighted in 1864 for his services to the censuses of Ireland.
So he was a man obsessed with meticulous documentation, with data.
Right.
It's so interesting, isn't it? The father, an empirical man of science, the eye and ear specialist, while the mother is this flamboyant, self-mythologizing poet.
It's the perfect setup.
So did Oscar rebel against the science, or did he incorporate that cool, meticulous observation into his own art? I think he kind of blended them.
I think that's a really good point. He approached his own life with the meticulous eye of a surgeon, observing and documenting the effects of his own poses.
Yeah.
And Sir William wasn't just a scientist either. He was an archaeologist who wrote extensively on Irish folklore, peasant life.
Yeah.
It shows this wide-ranging, maybe slightly scattered intellectual curiosity.
And he was also a major philanthropist. He founded a dispensary that became the forerunner of the Dublin Eye and Ear Hospital.
Exactly. And the family home on Marion Square was the hub of this intellectual salon. They hosted figures like the novelist Sheridan Le Fanu, the great mathematician William Rowan Hamilton.
So this was not some quiet, conservative Victorian upbringing.
Not at all. It was noisy, argumentative, intellectual, and deeply theatrical. The world was basically presented to him as a stage for ideas.
Yet despite this vibrant setting, there was some early profound sorrow.
Yes. The death of his younger sister, Isla, at just 9 years old, from a febrile illness, it left Oscar grief-stricken.
And the sources show he later commemorated her loss in his poem Requiescat.
It's a reminder that behind all that dazzling wit, there was a deeply sensitive, vulnerable man.
And there's family complexity, too. Sir William, before his marriage to Jane, he acknowledged and provided for 3 paternal half-siblings born out of wedlock.
Which must have just destabilized that strict notion of Victorian family propriety.
Of course. And it must have informed Oscar's later very complicated understanding of what was acceptable social behavior versus, your personal reality.
So moving on from Dublin, we see this transition into the academic world. And this is where Wilde truly began forging the classicist and the aesthete.
Right. At Portora Royal School, he excelled in classics, won the Carpenter Prize for Greek Testament, and the sources mention this prodigious speed-reading ability.
Oh yeah, he allegedly claims he could read a 3-volume book in half an hour and retain the plot.
Which speaks to an extraordinary intellectual capacity. It's almost a metaphor for his entire life, isn't it? Consuming massive amounts of information quickly, synthesizing it, and then presenting the distilled essence as his own effortless wit.
Mm-hmm. He attended Trinity College, Dublin from 1871 to 74, reading classics with Professor J.P. Mahaffy. Wilde later called Mahaffy my first and best teacher.
And he was an outstanding student. He got the Berkeley Gold Medal in Greek, which was the college's highest academic award.
Mahaffy's pride was immense. He boasted that he had created Wilde, only to later lament that Wilde was the only blot on my tutorship once the public pose really emerged.
You can just feel the tension there. Intellectual pride battling Victorian social anxiety.
The academic system creates the genius, but then it rejects the consequence of that genius.
He then moved on to Magdalen College, Oxford, from 74 to 78, reading greats, earning a double first. And this is the true crucible where his public identity was formed.
Heavily influenced by the 2 defining figures of the aesthetic and decadent movements, his tutors, Walter Pater and John Ruskin.
And the clash between these 2 is just philosophically crucial. It explains the central conflict in Wilde's later work.
It really does. On one hand, you have Walter Pater's studies in the history of the Renaissance, a book Wilde memorized tracts of, carried everywhere.
And it emphasized refining your sensibility to beauty above all else, living intensely, fully in the moment. The pursuit of beauty was the highest moral good.
Right, but standing diametrically opposed to that was John Ruskin,
who argued that art must be fundamentally allied with moral good and societal betterment. It had to be useful, ethical, contributory to the common good.
This created an impossible philosophical tightrope for Wilde to walk. He was drawn to Pater's seductive emphasis on sensation and beauty for its own sake, but he was also deeply affected by Ruskin's call to action, his moral responsibility.
The sources give us that perfect anecdote, don't they? Despite openly disliking manual labor, Wilde volunteered for Ruskin's quixotic project to convert a swampy lane into a smart, usable road.
He literally attempted to dirty his hands for the sake of moral art, an experiment. Let's just say he quickly abandoned.
That tension between art for its own sake and art as moral instruction, it seems impossible to sustain. And his works, like Dorian Gray, they become his own philosophical battleground, not just a novel.
He chose Pater's beauty, but the consequences, the tragedy, were all Ruskinian in their moralizing force.
And this philosophical tension played out directly in his famous pose.
Oh yeah, he decorated his rooms flamboyantly. Peacock feathers, lilies, and of course the blue china, deliberately courting controversy.
Which was all summarized by his famous remark, "I find it harder and harder every day to live up to my blue china."
That quote is so often just used as a joke, but it's a manifesto, isn't it?
It is. It means that the manufactured perfection of the aesthetic ideal he created required tremendous conscious effort. And ultimately, it was exhausting. He was trapped by the very image he designed.
And that image was quickly established as the languorous dandy who scorned all physical endeavor. Yet the sources tell us something surprising that completely subverts that simplified image.
This is what I couldn't believe. He occasionally boxed and, during a notorious incident at Oxford, single-handedly fended off 4 students who physically assaulted him.
Proving he possessed a physical capability that completely surprised his detractors.
So this famously languorous dandy, the man who scorned sports, actually boxed and fought off assailants. That just disrupts the fragile, effeminate image he was trying so hard to project.
It speaks to the contradictions of his character. He was never just one thing. And this complex intellectual curiosity also extended to his faith. He was deeply drawn to Catholicism's rich liturgy, the symbolism, the ritual. He discussed converting several times. He even met Pope Pius IX in Rome.
But the supreme individualist couldn't commit to a formal creed, could he?
Never. When he was serious about converting in 1878, he met with a priest, but balked at the last minute from pledging allegiance to the necessary dogma.
So instead of attending his appointed baptism, he sent a bouquet of altar
He
lilies.
found beauty in the ritual, but not submission in the faith.
Precisely. In terms of his concrete early literary efforts, he won the 1878 Newdigate Prize for his poem Ravenna.
Right, and then he published poems in 1881. It was commercially successful. It sold out its first run of 750 copies,
But the critics were harsh. The popular magazine Punch famously dismissed it as tame.
which led to that enduring quote, "The poet is wild, but his poetry's tame."
The early critics dismissed him as tame, which is just deeply ironic considering the spectacular wildness of his personal life that was brewing just beneath the surface.
That scathing Punch review effectively marks the end of his early poetry phase and the beginning of his celebrity phase. The 1880s is when Wilde moves fully into London society and begins to truly perform the aesthete that would define his public image.
He settled in London after graduation, set himself up as a bachelor, and he immediately sought out and charmed the people who mattered.
A key early friendship developed with Lily Langtry, who was called the most glamorous woman in England.
Right. He tutored her in Latin and encouraged her dramatic career. This shows he was networking with the social elite, not just the intellectual avant-garde.
And his public reputation as the expert dandy and conversationalist grew so rapidly that aestheticism itself became this cultural phenomenon ripe for satire,
Which led directly to the Gilbert and Sullivan opera, Patience.
which successfully caricatured the whole movement. And it was that very notoriety that led to his first massive opportunity, the American tour of 1882.
Richard Doyley Cart, the impresario, invited Wilde to North America specifically to prime interest for the U.S. tour of Patience.
So he was hired to lecture on the very thing that the opera was mocking.
It's a remarkable cultural feedback loop. The tour was a huge commercial success. It lasted nearly a year instead of the planned 4 months.
And Wilde lectured on the English Renaissance, arguing for the integration of beauty into daily life through art and interior design, a kind of fusion of Pater's philosophy and Ruskin's practical application.
He was also a conscious, brilliant mythmaker throughout. The question was asked repeatedly, did you parade down Piccadilly with a lily?
And his self-aware reply was perfect. It's not whether I did it or not that's important, but whether people believed I did it.
Which just shows he understood that fame was an act of creation. His life was his greatest art project.
Despite the commercial success and the sophisticated audiences, his reception was not universally positive. The sources stress that he faced significant hostility from the press.
Often including severe anti-Irish caricatures.
Oh, yeah. He was sometimes portrayed as a monkey or, really offensively, as a blackface performer. The Washington Post illustrated him alongside the wild man of Borneo.
This hostile critique reminds us that beneath the veneer of the sophisticated London dandy, he was still an Irishman operating in the heart of the empire, and that anti-Irish prejudice surfaced the moment he became too visibly successful or unconventional.
Yet, his charm transcended simple social lines. He was feted in the highest salons, but he also claimed to have drunk whiskey with miners in Leadville, Colorado.
An incredibly versatile performer who could adapt his persona to any audience.
Upon his return, he focused on stability, or at least the appearance of it. In 1884, he married Constance Lloyd in an Anglican ceremony.
They settled into a renovated, very expensive home at No. 16 Tite Street, Chelsea. They had 2 sons, Cyril and Vivian, and the financial demands of this new, elegant life required constant income.
And briefly, he engaged with serious political concerns, which shows his awareness extended beyond the drawing room. He became the sole literary signatory on George Bernard Shaw's petition seeking a pardon for the anarchists arrested after the Haymarket Massacre in Chicago in 1886.
A crucial side of Wilde that's often forgotten, he put his reputation on the line for political causes. But at the same time, his domestic life was fracturing.
Yes. The sources note that in 1886, Wilde was initiated into homosexual sex by Robert Ross, a precocious 17-year-old at Oxford.
This initiation marked a profound and permanent shift. It reportedly occurred after Constance's second pregnancy, when the marriage was already under some strain.
So he was now living a full double life, one public, wealthy, and domesticated, and one secret, sensual, and dangerous.
To support his family and his lifestyle, he entered the, let's call it, tedious world of professional labor. From 1887 to 1889, he accepted the editorship of the Ladies' World magazine.
Which he immediately renamed the Woman's World.
Right, and he genuinely intended to elevate the content. He added serious articles on culture and politics, solicited contributions from his wide artistic circle, even his wife.
But the sources note that despite his initial vigor, the administrative grind just became tedious. Sales remained low, he was a creator, not an administrator, and he left in 1889.
It was also during this period that his reputation for original wit led to that very public, very painful falling out with the artist James McNeill Whistler.
Ah, yes. Wilde was famous for his bon mots. One of his jokes was that Whistler had no enemies, but was intensely disliked by his friends.
But the conflict culminated in that devastating, perfect exchange. Wilde exclaimed he wished he had said a witty line Whistler had just produced.
And Whistler's retort, "You will, Oscar, you will," guessed. It captures not just the humor, but the underlying anxiety that everyone suspected Oscar borrowed his brilliance, even as he was famous for it.
That one line broke their friendship.
So having exhausted the possibilities of conversation, journalism, and public posing, Wilde finally pivoted to the serious prose writing that would define him. A change in medium, but the message, the primacy of beauty and individualism, that remained the same.
This shift led to his major prose period between 1888 and 1891. He produced these beautiful, slightly unsettling works like The Fairy Stories, The Happy Prince, and Other Tales.
And A House of Pomegranates, alongside short fiction like Lord Arthur Saville's Crime.
Then there's the portrait of Mr. W.H. from 1889. This story beautifully illustrates his belief that to shed oneself of an idea, one must first convince another of its truth.
He was building theories that justified his own emerging lifestyle. The story advanced the theory that Shakespeare's sonnets were written out of love for a boy actor, Willie Hughes, based on a couple of purported puns. A literary fantasy dressed up as criticism.
He collected his deeper aesthetic theories and intentions in 1891 using the dialogue form he had mastered as a conversationalist. These essays, like The Decay of Lying and The Critic as Artist.
They laid out his formal, intellectual case against moralizing on art. His core argument, and I'm quoting the sources here, was that art is individualism, and individualism is a disturbing and disintegrating force.
That antisocial sentiment, the idea that art should disturb rather than soothe, feeds directly into his only political text, The Soul of Man Under Socialism.
Which is often misunderstood, but it's crucial for understanding his individualism.
Right. We need to slow down here because Wilde's socialism was incredibly unique. He was not advocating for collective labor or traditional economic reform.
No. His argument was profoundly aesthetic, not economic. He proposed that cooperation should replace competition, converting private property into public wealth. But the entire purpose of this societal shift was to free humanity from necessity.
So he envisioned a future society populated by artists, freed from the necessity of labor by machines, focusing solely on creation.
It's a utopian vision built around the assumption that the highest human pursuit is aesthetic creation. And critically, he stressed that the best government for artists was no government at all.
So this radical individualism alienated both the conservative moneyed classes he dined with and the traditional communal socialists he briefly collaborated with.
He was politically isolated by his own purity of thought.
And this philosophy provided the bedrock for the novel that defined his decadent phase, The Picture of Dorian Gray, first published in Lippincott's Monthly magazine in July 1890. The plot device is just genius. Dorian Gray inadvertently makes a Faustian bargain, where only his painted portrait shows the ravages of time and the consequences of his increasingly hedonistic life, while he remains eternally young and beautiful.
It's the ultimate aesthetic novel. It juxtaposes the beauty of the artistic surface Dorian's body with the moral ugliness of the reality it hides in the painting.
And reviewers immediately understood what he was doing, and they reacted with, well, profound shock and moral panic.
They called it unclean, poisonous, heavy with moral and spiritual putrefaction, all due to its clear decadence and the veiled but undeniable homosexual subtext.
Wilde responded vigorously to the critics, clarifying his formalist stance in that famous preface he added for the 1891 book publication.
Featuring epigrams like, "Books are well written or badly written, that is all."
And there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. He was trying to provide an intellectual shield against the moral outrage.
He also revised the text extensively, adding 6 chapters and excising some of the more overt homoeroticism, a sophisticated legal and philosophical maneuver.
But the damage was done. The novel established him as the master of decadence, and, critically, it served later as evidence of his immorality in court. The distinction between the artist and his work was just completely lost on Victorian society. The 1890s saw Wilde reach his creative and, crucially, his financial zenith by turning back to drama. While he was in Paris in 1891, he wrote Salome in French.
A tragedy about Salome requesting the head of John the Baptist.
This play had high expectations. Sarah Bernhardt even starred in rehearsals, but it was immediately refused a license in England.
Right, because the portrayal of biblical subjects was prohibited on stage. It's just another example of the constraints Victorian morality imposed on his pure aesthetic vision.
And it's so ironic that the play was eventually first performed in Paris in 1896, when he was already in prison for other moral crimes.
But this failure led him to pivot to a genre he absolutely conquered, the society comedy.
He found runaway success by critiquing Victorian society on its own terms, targeting his audience with adroit precision. His first major hit, Lady Windermere's Fan, in 1892.
Subtly subverted harsh social codes involving reputation and forgiveness. And the money was just staggering.
I mean, that play was enormously successful. It earned him £7,000 in the first year alone. You can't just say he was successful. We have to emphasize that this is the equivalent of nearly £1 million today.
He had achieved massive, mainstream establishment financial validation, the very establishment he was secretly undermining.
That financial success continued rapidly with A Woman of No Importance in 1893, and then An Ideal Husband in 1895. By every metric, he was one of the most successful and wealthy playwrights in London.
His undisputed masterpiece, of course, is The Importance of Being Earnest, which premiered in February 1895. Written in his artistic maturity, lighter in tone.
Lacking that woman with a past archetype found in the earlier plays.
Right. The plot revolves entirely around Bunburying, maintaining alternative personas or double lives to escape stifling social rules. The very structure of the play mirrors his own double life. He was writing a comedy based on the necessity of deception.
H.G. Wells, reviewing it, praised the humor that is Gilbertian, decorated with Wilde's innumerable spangles of that wit. It was an immediate triumph and cemented his artistic reputation forever.
But the personal cost of this height of fame was immense, and it was inextricably linked to his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, known to everyone as Bosie.
Introduced in 1891, they began what the sources call a tempestuous affair.
Wilde, now running up to £100 a week, indulged Douglas's every whim, material, artistic, or sexual. This level of conspicuous consumption and reckless spending was completely unsustainable, but it fueled a relationship.
And most dangerously, through Douglas and his associate Alfred Taylor, Wilde was introduced to the Victorian sexual underground, working-class male prostitutes from 1892 onward.
He offered them lavish gifts, dined them privately, blurring class lines that Victorian society violently protected.
This terrifying duality, the grand public figure with two massive hits running at the same time, and the secret life indulging in extreme danger, it led to that chilling, haunting description in De Profundis.
It was like feasting with panthers. The danger was half the excitement. He was fully aware of the risk, but the proximity to catastrophe fueled the aesthetic experience for him.
Which brings us directly to the gathering storm, the Queensberry feud.
John Sholto Douglas, the 9th Marquess of Queensberry, Bosie's father, known for creating modern boxing rules, intensely disapproved of his son's relationship with Wilde. He saw it as corrupting and disgraceful.
The feud escalated into outright warfare. Queensberry confronted Wilde in 1894, demanding he cease seeing his son, threatening, "If I catch you and my son again in any public restaurant, I will thrash you."
And Wilde, in this moment of hubris fueled by his success, shot back with his own confidence. I don't know what the Queensberry rules are, but the Oscar Wilde rule is to shoot on sight.
Queensberry was determined to publicly humiliate Wilde. He intended to throw rotting vegetables onto the stage during the Earnest premiere,
Which would have ruined the play and Wilde's reputation. But Wilde had him barred. This public conflict set the stage for the catastrophic legal disaster just 15 weeks later. The speed of the destruction is what's so staggering.
He was at his artistic and financial zenith, and then he was in prison a few months later. The actual mechanism of the fall began on February 18, 1895. Queensberry, thwarted at the theater, left his infamous calling card at Wilde's club.
Inscribed with, "For Oscar Wilde posing sodomite," with sodomite misspelled.
This was the trap, And Wilde, spurred on by Bosie and against the fervent, repeated advice of every sensible friend he had,
Like Frank Harris, who warned him to flee immediately.
he issued a civil writ for criminal libel. This was a hugely reckless and risky move.
It was reckless because a charge of criminal libel carried a possible sentence of up to 2 years in prison if Queensberry lost.
Yeah.
But more importantly, under the Libel Act 1843, Queensberry could only avoid conviction by proving two things.
One, that the accusation was true in substance and in fact.
And two, that it was for some public benefit.
So Queensberry's defense team, they turned into a forensic investigative unit, hiring private detectives to dig up every single piece of evidence of Wilde's homosexual liaisons' names, addresses, gifts, dates.
Wilde's life was about to be put on brutal public display.
Frank Harris warned him to flee to France immediately, saying Queensberry's lawyers would easily prove sodomy. But Wilde just dismissed the advice,
Showing either a fatal paralysis of inaction or this hubristic belief that his charm could win over the jury. He's reported to have just said, "The train is gone, it's too late."
The libel trial began at the Old Bailey in April 1895, and it captivated and horrified Victorian society in equal measure.
And Queensberry's lawyer, Edward Carson QC, was a formidable and particularly cruel opponent, a fellow Dubliner from Wilde's time at Trinity College.
They knew each other, which must have made the betrayal feel so personal.
Carson's cross-examination was devastating because he deviated from normal legal protocol. He turned the courtroom into a philosophical battleground.
He attacked Wilde's core literary theories first, asking how he perceived the moral content of his work.
And this is where Wilde, true to his philosophy, offered his iconic but entirely counterproductive defense, that art is only capable of being well or poorly made, and that only brutes and illiterates would judge art morally.
Intellectually brilliant, but legally suicidal.
Completely. Carson then systematically pressed on Wilde's credibility. He forced Wilde to admit lying about his age under oath. Wilde was 40, but claimed 39, justifying Queensberry's accusation of posing.
He also quoted directly from Dorian Gray to paint Wilde's decadent philosophy as corrupting, treating the novel as biographical evidence of a criminal mindset.
The fatal line of questioning centered on Wilde's friendships with lower-class males, some as young as 16, implying they were prostitutes. Wilde admitted to being on a first-name basis and lavishing gifts on them.
Insisting they were merely friends and that he didn't believe in social barriers, he was trying to maintain a position of benevolent aristocracy.
But the moment of legal disaster came when Carson asked directly if he had kissed a certain servant boy.
And Wilde, trying to employ his characteristic flippancy, replied, "Oh dear no, he was a particularly plain boy, unfortunately ugly. I pitied him for it."
That flippant remark cost him everything. Carson seized on it, repeatedly asking why the boy's looks were relevant, forcing Wilde to break his composure.
He became completely flustered, saying Carson was trying to unnerve me.
This single lapse proved that his aesthetic standards, not merely friendship, governed his selection of companions, linking his artistic theory directly to the moral accusations.
So when Carson announced that he had witnesses, male prostitutes, ready to testify to sexual acts with Wilde, his lawyers advised him to drop the prosecution immediately.
Queensberry was found not guilty, and the fallout was immediate. Wilde was left legally liable for Queensberry's substantial defense expenses, leading directly to his bankruptcy.
But the law did not stop there. The moment the libel case collapsed, a warrant was issued for Wilde's arrest for gross indecency.
It's vital to understand the legal mechanism here. He was charged under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885. This act wasn't originally aimed specifically at consensual acts.
No, but it created this powerful, blunt instrument, Section 11, which criminalized any male intimacy that did not amount to the capital crime of buggery. It was a net cast wide, and Wilde flew straight into it.
Friends again advised him to flee the country immediately, recognizing the severity of the charge. But Wilde, perhaps still paralyzed, stayed.
At the second criminal trial, prosecutor Charles Gill asked that famous loaded question, "What is the love that dare not speak its name?"
Wilde's response, despite being legally perilous, was magnificent. He delivered a powerful speech defining it as such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan.
And such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy. He called it beautiful, pure as it is perfect, and intellectual.
Adding that the world mocks at it and sometimes puts one in the pillory for it.
That statement was met with loud applause in the courtroom, mingled with some hisses. It shows the fierce split in public opinion, even as it was illegal.
Legally, however, it reinforced the prosecutor's case that Wilde was publicly advocating for illegal behavior.
The first jury was unable to reach a verdict, suggesting some division, but in the final trial, on May 25, 1895, Wilde and Alfred Taylor were convicted of gross indecency.
And sentenced to 2 years hard labor, the maximum penalty.
The judge, in his sentencing, called the maximum penalty totally inadequate for a case such as this. This reveals the extreme moralizing vengeance driving the judicial system at the time.
So Wilde was jailed for 2 years, from May 1895 to May 1897, and his journey through the prison system was one of systematic, unrelenting physical and mental degradation, deliberately designed to break the spirit.
He was first held at Newgate, then Pentonville, where the hard labor was literal and brutal. This included walking a treadmill, often for hours a day, and picking oakum,
Separating the fibers and scraps of old Navy ropes. An agonizingly tedious and thankless task. The intellectual, sensory-driven aesthete reduced to brute physical toil.
The mental deprivation was just as acute. Inmates were only allowed to read 2 books, the Bible and the Pilgrim's Progress.
The man who memorized Pater and corresponded with great artists was starved of all intellectual stimulus.
And his health, which was never robust, suffered immensely. At Wandsworth, he collapsed from illness and hunger, fracturing his right eardrum in the fall.
The sources are clear that this injury, an old ear separation, was poorly treated, and it contributed directly to the fatal mastoid infection that killed him years later. The prison system literally planted the seed of his death.
The lowest point of his incarceration, however, was his transfer in November 1895 to Reading Gaol. This was an experience of profound public shaming.
He was moved from London, and at Clapham Junction railway station, a crowd gathered and jeered and spat at him on the platform.
You can just imagine the scene. The most famous man in Britain, the master of society and wit, reduced to a publicly humiliated, sickly target of working-class hatred. It was the complete obliteration of the pose.
For the remainder of his sentence at Reading, he was known only by the dehumanizing moniker C3.3, third cell on the 3rd floor of C Ward.
This stripping away of identity Oscar Wilde reduced to a sequential number is a psychological tactic of incarceration that must have been agonizing for a man who defined himself solely by his name and persona.
Fortunately, there was a small intervention. Due to the efforts of Richard B. Haldane, a Liberal MP and penal reformer, Wilde was eventually allowed greater privileges.
Specifically, access to books and writing materials. The intellectual life, which they had tried to strip away, was cautiously restored.
And he requested texts by Dante, works in ancient Greek, and essays by Cardinal Newman and Walter Pater.
The fact that he requested Pater, the original inspiration for the aesthetic life that led him to prison, is just fascinating. It shows he was trying to reconcile the source of his triumph with the source of his failure.
This crucial respite allowed him to write his most searing and deeply personal work, De Profundis, literally out of the depths.
Written between January and March 1897, a staggering 50,000-word letter addressed to Lord Alfred Douglas, which he was allowed to take with him upon release.
The letter is essentially an agonizing attempt at psychological and spiritual reckoning. He begins by placing his identity in high, almost tragic terms, stating his role as one who stood in symbolic relations to the art and culture of my age.
He sees himself not merely as a failed man, but as a symbolic martyr to the conflict between art and life. The first half is a stunning, cold repudiation of Douglas, whom he blames for arrogance, vanity, and encouraging his reckless behavior.
He recalls Douglas's stunning cruelty, citing the remark made when Wilde was ill. When you are not on your pedestal, you are not interesting.
Chilling.
This repudiation is necessary for Wilde to begin reconstructing his identity. He had to separate his genius from his destructive attachment to Bosie. But the letter shifts dramatically in the second half. It moves towards self-analysis and acceptance of his suffering.
He comes to a profound philosophical conclusion. To regret one's own experiences is to arrest one's own development. He realized the experience of suffering was as essential to the artist as the experience of pleasure.
He describes his mistake as confining himself so exclusively to the trees of what seemed to me the sunlit side of the garden and shunned the other side for its shadow and its gloom.
He recognized that the ordeal had filled his soul with experience, the experience of the outcast, the criminal, the pariah. His art, he implies, would now be complete, incorporating both the light and the shadow.
The full, correct transcription wasn't published until 1962, which is when we finally got the essential, uncensored psychological documentation of his time in prison. Wilde was released on May 19, 1897, financially and physically broken. He immediately sailed for Dieppe, France, fulfilling the promise that he would never return to Britain or Ireland.
In exile, he adopted the name Sebastian Melmoth, a fascinating choice. Sebastian, the Christian martyr, often depicted in art suffering from arrows, symbolizing his own public martyrdom.
And Melmoth was a character from a Gothic novel by his great-uncle, representing darkness, suffering, and the cursed wanderer. The name itself is a synthesis of the tragic path he now walked.
Despite his shattered health, he engaged in one final act of social conscience, a surprising return to the principles of Ruskin and social betterment.
He wrote 2 long, powerful letters to the Daily Chronicle, describing the brutal conditions of English prisons and arguing passionately for penal reform.
These letters detailed specific horrors, like the dismissal of a warder for giving biscuits to an anemic child prisoner. This was a man using his famous name to advocate for the lowest and most vulnerable in society, driven by his own experience of degradation.
A remarkable piece of counter-narrative to the selfish dandy.
His final major literary work, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, was published in 1898. A long, powerful poem commemorating the execution of Charles Thomas Wooldridge, a trooper who murdered his wife.
Wilde adopted the proletarian ballad form, a stark contrast to his earlier sophisticated comedies, to reach a broad audience. It was initially credited only to C-33.
The poem highlighted the brutality of punishment and the shared suffering of all convicts.
And its central, enduring, and self-referential line is that haunting juxtaposition. Yet each man kills the thing he loves.
A line that speaks volumes about his own destructive relationship with his life, his art, and Bosie. It's a commentary on human nature itself.
And despite the nature of the author, or maybe because of the anonymity of C-33, the ballad was a commercial success. It went through 7 editions before his name was finally added to the title page. His talent, even in this raw, brutal form, just could not be suppressed.
His final years were marked by poverty and isolation. He briefly reunited with Douglas in Naples until their respective families threatened to cut off all financial support, forcing them apart.
Wilde just could not escape the economic consequences of his choices. He spent his last years impoverished at the dingy Hotel d'Alsace in Paris.
Though he corrected proofs for An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest, he refused to undertake any new writing. He said, just heartbreakingly, "I can write, but have lost the joy of writing."
The engine of his genius was broken by the trauma.
It is during this final, painful period that he delivered perhaps his last great self-deprecating line, joking about his failing health and surroundings. "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has got to go."
A final, perfect piece of aesthetic drama, even when confronting death.
Wilde died on November 30th, 1900 at age 46 of meningitis, likely following a mastoidectomy for that old ear suppuration stemming from his prison injury.
And before his death, he was conditionally baptized into the Catholic Church by a Passionist priest, Far Cuthbert Dunn, finally fulfilling that lifelong interest he had resisted in his pursuit of individualism.
The recognition of his significance has only grown since his death. His remains were transferred to Père Lachaise Cemetery in 1909 to the famous tomb designed by Sir Jacob Epstein. It's still a site of pilgrimage today.
And more recently, his legacy has intersected directly with legal history and justice. In 2017, Wilde was among an estimated 50,000 men posthumously pardoned for homosexual acts, no longer considered offenses under what is known informally as the Alan Turing Law.
It took more than a century for the state to acknowledge the moral bankruptcy of its prosecution.
And in a wonderful piece of symbolic restoration, the British Library restored Wilde's library card 130 years after it was revoked following his conviction. He is formally commemorated today with a stained glass window in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey, unveiled in 1995.
The establishment he fought against eventually claimed him as its own.
So we've journeyed through the entire arc of Oscar Wilde, from his intellectual origins in that unique Dublin home, through his adoption of aesthetic philosophy at Oxford, to his dazzling million-pound success as a playwright, and finally, the brutal consequences of his trials under the Criminal Law Amendment Act.
The narrative we've traced is one of escalating stakes. The persona he built, the one that allowed him to charm America and conquer London, was the very thing that made him vulnerable in court.
He was too good at performing his own life, and when that life was put on trial, the mask was stripped away.
The key takeaway for you, the learner, is how Wilde's life vividly demonstrates the extreme tension between art, morality, and social conformity in the Victorian era.
He lived his core philosophy, that life should imitate art, to the fullest, challenging social norms, through his flamboyant persona, his literature like Dorian Gray, and ultimately, his public actions.
And this challenge to Victorian standards led directly to his destruction, but also to his immortality.
His enduring relevance is undeniable. His literary output, the dazzling wit of the comedies, and the deep, penetrating despair of De Profundis and the Ballad of Reading Gaol cemented his reputation.
Moreover, his legal struggle is a landmark case in the history of LGBTQ rights and legal reform, echoing even today with those posthumous pardons under the Alan Turing Law.
He often cited that early critical assessment of his poetry, where Punch claimed, "The poet is wild, but his poetry is tame." So knowing the full scope of his genius, from the biting epigrams of Ernest to the deep spiritual despair of De Profundis, this raises an important question for you to consider. What aspect of his work, written or performed, truly constitutes the immortal genius that he once claimed to have been his only thing to declare at customs? Was the immortal genius found in the beautiful, frivolous art he created, or in the devastating, profound suffering that he finally embraced?